I'm going to introduce the first of our PhD creative researchers. Bekilizwe Bernard Ndlovu is a Zimbabwean-born researcher practitioner with a background in human resources management, acting, and writing. His research interests are a combination of his human resources management training and applied drama, resulting in him finding himself doing more and more on behavioral change work and research. Over to you, Bekilizwe.
So can I share my PowerPoint? Am I a co-host? Have I been made co-host?
I think you'll be made in a minute if you're not already. Yeah, okay.
You should be able to share. Just go ahead.
Yeah. Okay. Good afternoon, and thank you for making me part of this enriching process. So what I'm dealing with, I'll just take you through the whole research, introduce the title of the PhD, and then zero in on the particular paper that I am sharing with you today, or the concept of the particular paper. So the title of my research is Violent Strikes in the South African Workplace, an Applied Drama Perspective. And as you can see there's a quote from Schechner. For now, let me say that the performative occurs in places and situations not traditionally marked as performing arts, from dress up and drag to certain kinds of writing and speaking. And I found myself, as my profile says, having to think of the workplace where I used to work as a human resources practitioner, and the beauty of applied drama, and then coming up with this PhD, because when I was there, I used to think a lot about what do you do about things like strikes. You know, we spoke a lot about the three areas of training, which are skill, knowledge, and attitude. And I thought that strikes were about attitude, and then began to think of how do you train attitude? Is it something that can be trained? Is it something that can be developed as a behavior or changed under behavioral change? So my research question generally is to what extent can we understand and address violent strikes in the South African workplace using the habitats and applied drama theories and techniques? That's the question that I'm having to create a process a research process to answer. And I have my 7 chapters there. So my approach has been, a PhD by publication. So I'm writing these with that. And the first chapter is obviously the intro one, where I'm dealing with the aim, rationale, and selective literature review and research design. Chapter 2, violent strikes in essay, a case for applied drama, through an exploration of 3 case studies. So I'm starting by arguing that if it can be applied in these 3, if it could be applied in these 3 areas, which are the Kamiridi project, the Kenyan project that happened a long time ago, the Laramie project, and the performance of a lifetime campaign that is actually happening even now. Then looking at the elements and arguing for it being applicable to the workplace, and specifically on strikes, violent strikes. And then, so chapter 4 then becomes, or rather chapter 3, exploring violent strikes in the South African workplace using the lens of role and habitats theory. And therefore, reading the current situation of violent strikes in the South African workplace as an experimentation with freedom. And then coming to the actual paper that I am sharing with you today, where I then went into stories, or I'm going into stories, and the title of that paper is Narrative Inquiry, the South African Workplace, and Locating Violent Strikes in Personal Stories. In chapter 6, I'm then using embodied work which is a strategic narrative embodiment, towards new perspectives in addressing violent strikes in the South African workplace. And chapter 7 becomes a general discussion and conclusion. The research question for this particular paper is to what extent can using the narrative inquiry together with the participants become a study of their lived experiences to help them understand their own behavior regarding violent strikes in the South African workplace. So that's the question I'm wanting to answer. A quotation from Dykes there, actually by Penny Brown, Professor Penny Brown. Stories are just, but data with the soul. So this study employs a story to begin the process of involving employees in understanding themselves and their participation in violent strikes. And to do so, the study employs a methodology from the field of applied drama and other fields called the narrative inquiry. The data is collected through listening technically to narratives, responding to questions, and analyzed for evidence of themes, attitude, and the patterns that relate to violent strikes and the understanding of the depth of the issues, consciously or unconsciously. Oh, sorry about that, I moved. The data is collected. The exploration makes use of a qualitative thematic narrative analysis of data and discourse analysis in the form of facilitation material and responses, participants' feedback, and semi-structured interviews. I keep moving to the. This study using narrative inquiry contributes the process of, or to the process of research of the researcher and the participants using personal stories to understand violent strikes and their conscious or unconscious participation in the violence, and a new knowledge creation tool in organizational, community contexts relating to participations in violent strikes. And the strategy works like this in all this. So listening to stories about employment and strikes in order to get data about how events and entities connect to each other, and how the present and the past connect to each other, and what themes and patterns emerge to help me understand the phenomenon of violent strikes. The use of triangulation to get a more objective answer to the issues at stake, as stories are told subjectively. So needing to then get it from different perspectives, and because strikes are a collective, thing. They're a group thing. I'm adding the element of focus groups, and not just interviewing individuals on a one-on-one, but I'm going to create the focus groups and create a space where, again, questions are asked in that, and there will be no order as to say you answer, but just to allow the space to be a story space, talking about violent strikes, going back to the past and the now. And then, because stories are by their nature long, the sample doesn't have to be too big, because already when that individual is talking, they are talking as an individual, but telling a story about strikes and about the collective. So the story world and the tell world then come together to assist me to gather this data, to harvest this data, not just from the point of view of the story being told, but also from the specific environment where it happened, where the events happened. So in a nutshell, that's my presentation about this particular paper that I'm looking at today. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Beckley's, where you actually wrapped up our time issue really well, because we started late, but you've actually finished exactly where we need to be at this point. So thank you very much. We'll move to the next presenter. Bronwyn Horn is the academic head at the Animation School and is currently completing her PhD in the Witt School of Arts. She holds an MA in Digital Arts Animation and MTech Fine Arts cum laude. Her PhD research interest focuses on developing a hybrid animation technique through creative practice that addresses certain aspects of chronophotography and issues of perception. Welcome, Bronwyn.
Thank you very much. I'm just going to share my screen. Can you see it?
Yes, yes.
Okay.
It's here.
Okay, thank you very much for this opportunity to present my research by creative practice today. I just wanted to say that I'm currently in the completion stage of writing up my thesis. I was very lucky, very fortunate to have completed the creative practice and exhibited the work in February of 2020, just before the pandemic hit our country. Okay, so character animation has rapidly become a popular form of entertainment. It's a diverse medium with a long history that has resulted in varying approaches, techniques, and styles. Classic cartoon style animation is renowned for its absurdity, excessive style, and abstract approaches to representation. My interest lies in the movements in these cartoons, the imperceptible moments that are lost in standard viewing practice. Using techniques of chronophotography, my creative practice reveals the construction of animation for the viewer. It's about sequences, a series of images that question our understanding of a movement and the aesthetics involved in seeing more than one frame at a time. In doing this, I challenge the viewer to look at cartoons in a different way. What does viewing a sequence of images do to our experience and understanding of that image? An image that normally only remains on our retina for 1/24th of a second. My aim is to slow animation down, even freeze it in some instances, with the aim of transforming it from a process of illusion to a method of investigation. It's about making the imperceptible perceptible and raises questions about how images speak to us. Chronophotography is used extensively by animators as a fundamental resource for how living beings move. It was a photographic technique from the Victorian era intended to reveal the mechanics of movement, capturing what the eye could not see due to the limitations of human perception. My interest is in chronophotography as a representational practice and the aesthetic opportunities it affords artists. I am particularly interested in the work of Edward Muybridge and Etienne Jules Moret. In my thesis, I focus on their opposing approaches to their interests in movement analysis and present an argument for how their distinct representational formats influence viewer engagement and consequent readings of their work. Early photography was celebrated for its ability to arrest motion and depict a reality that we were unable to see truthfully with the naked eye. Edward Muybridge played a pivotal role in the evolution of the photographic instant. His 1878 images of a horse not only resolved the mystery of unsupported transport in the horse's gait, but offered the conditions for what cinema was to become. Arguably, his greatest innovation was how he approached Governor Stanford's request for a single image of a horse with all four legs off the ground. He understood that in order to analyze motion, you needed to photograph a sequence of images fractions of a second apart. And his choice to present the sequence of images to an audience assembled in a manner that suggests motion was even more critical. In my thesis, I explore modes of viewing practice through Muybridge's Animal Locomotion series of 1887. I argue that by using creative choices in the presentation of his images, it affects viewer interaction and subsequent readings of the work. Muybridge has continually been criticized for scientific authenticity. I recognize how he used his foundational artistic knowledge and pictorial traditions to condition the way he used the camera, seeking innovative methods for representing his photographic subjects and motion studies. Contrastingly, Etienne Jules Moret was a medical physician, an inventor, and a scientist. His systematic approach led him to seek visual representations of a continuous recorded event, first through chronography, which were his graphic notations, and then through photography, which was inspired by Muybridge's images, which he then termed chronophotography. For Moret, photographs allowed the viewer to assess movements of the body. Sorry, there's just a bit of background noise there. For Moret, photographs allowed the viewer to assess the movements of the body visually, revealing the various positions of the body whilst enacting a motion. But Moret was dissatisfied with the staccato effect of Muybridge's isolated phases of a movement. He was seeking a visible expression for continuity and the rhythm of a movement in a single image. By developing a photographic gun, he was able to capture a fluid visual expression of time and motion in his multi-exposed chronophotographs. Although created for the purpose of scientific analysis, it is an aesthetic that has inspired many artists throughout history, especially those concerned with time, memory, and consciousness in their practice. For instance, Marcel Duchamp's Nude Descending a Staircase is a static image of movement, movement as an abstraction, an interpretation expressed in a painting. Similarly, Norman McLaren applied the concept to his film Pas de Dieu to fulfill his fascination for representing movement for movement's sake, something he called abstract ballet. He explores the notion of movement moving, asking the question, how do we activate this feeling and keep it active in our perception? Contemporary artists are again finding a new interest in chronophotography by appropriating modern materials and technologies to suit their own purpose in research. They are in some way continuing one or more of the inquiries of the 19th century chronophotographers through their own practice. There are many aspects that draw artists to chronophotography. In my research, it was the investigative nature that inspired an experimental approach and the development of a hybrid animation technique to circumvent the restricting conventions tied to the standardized process. It was also the visual aesthetic of Maury's multi-exposed images, something I wanted to emulate in moving image practice. I saw this as an opportunity to escape the traditional modes of cinematic representation of viewing one frame at a time. In doing this, it raises questions about the mechanics of perception, the camera's truth versus lived experience. I also felt that through applying the technique, there was a potential to educate the viewer on how animation is made by exposing the components that make up an animated movement. So, is there a relationship between chronophotography and animation? Other than being an indispensable resource that provides accurate images of how the body moves in an action, as well as information on timing and duration of that action, it is not really used in any other way by contemporary animators. However, the sequential and superimposed nature of the images are commonplace in our practice. Analyzing movements in a frame-by-frame manner is what we do, but we are dealing with a lot more than what the audience sees in the final product. To put it simply, instead of seeing one man picking up a pencil, we need to keep a version of this man on every frame of the animation, or at the very minimum, the keys and breakdowns. The audience does not see it like this, but we use the software techniques called ghosting or onion skinning, which is similar to what you're seeing here, as a construction tool when designing a movement. But the process of revealing motion is not generally used to inform the aesthetic or conceptual nature of an animated work. My aim was to find a way of revealing this for the viewer in a way that was both aesthetically appealing and challenged the reading of the work. But how would I do this? So I first approached the question of what differentiates animation from live action film. They are both cinematic projections of moving, talking characters in some type of narrative framework. I argue that one of the key factors lies in movement itself. How do animated characters move? What makes them different? This led me to investigate how animation emerged as a practice. I do this by looking at one of the key role players, Walt Disney, and how he innovated techniques and practices to develop it into a viable commercial business model. I compared Disney's approach of realism or verisimilitude in animation with the abstract approach of the Warner Studio. I argue that while the Disney style was prolific, innovative, and to some degree established the medium, it created an emphasis on realism and other elements rooted in classic Hollywood cinema. Warner deviated from this approach, creating a fresh new style to animation, one that was dynamic, experimental, and skillfully elusive. The less constrained Warner Studio gave rise to some pivotal figures in animation, allowing them the freedom to explore their craft. Tex Avery and Chuck Jones are arguably some of the finest directors in animation history. With Avery's philosophy of anything can happen in a cartoon, and Jones's focus on character personality and innovative approaches to movement representation, they reacted to Disney's innovations, resulting in some of the most influential work in the animated medium. Smears, multiples, squashes, and stretches, these abstract and humorous approaches to movement representation are fundamental to what made these cartoons so memorable and differentiates animation from live action. But their construction goes unnoticed because they are represented to us at 24 frames per presented to us at 24 frames per second. One of these techniques are only on screen for 1 or 2 frames, making them imperceptible to the viewer. So how can this be exploited? What aspects of chronophotography can offer opportunities to explore these nuances of animation that are imperceptible to an audience? Chronophotography and animation bear an inverse relationship. One is a static image that isolates the phases of a realistic movement. The other uses chronological progression of images to mimic movements and caricature it. However, when viewing the individual frames of an animation side by side with a chronophotograph, the results are similar in approach and format. In my study, I propose an integrated method for examining and viewing animated motion. For this, I blend between chronophotographic and animation practices, so static and moving, and through doing so, highlight opportunities for creative exploration. I argue that static sequential images impose a complex interaction process on the viewer. Because of their fixed nature, the viewer has time to process the images using their own experience and understanding. But the cinematic format commands an interaction based on the method of presentation, which is at 24 frames a second and out of the viewer's control. This changes the nature of this engagement. It is the difference between a voluntary process versus the imposition of an illusionary experience. This research aims to bridge the gap between the still and the moving image in order to create an innovative viewing experience, one that imposes movement but forces the viewer to question the nature of its construction. It explores how chronophotographic techniques could be used to slow animated time for an unconventional aesthetic and a different viewing experience. I do this by applying the multi-exposed visual aesthetic of Maury's chronophotographs. By using an established yet underexplored animation technique called strata stencil, I demonstrate my interest in exposing the construction of animated movements in an experimental short film. Developed by animator and artist Javan Ivy in 2007, the strata stencil technique is derived from the mind-bending strata cut animation technique made popular by filmmakers like David Daniels of the 1980s. Strata cut is a form of stop motion where animation is embedded in a mound of clay, where movement is achieved by slicing thin sheets out of the loaf, which you see on the left. Strata stencil uses paper cutouts for each frame of the animation, where the movement is constructed according to traditional animation practices. Each individual cutout or stencil is then filmed in succession using stop motion techniques on a customized film rig. This technique allows each frame to remain visible for several frames. Pausing the sequence at any point of the animation will display a range of motion similar to Maury's images or the ghosting technique used in animation software, rather than a single slice of life presented in the animation in standard animation practice. And this is what drew me to the technique. The creative work resulted in two key outputs. Together, entitled The Chronomation, it comprises of an experimental animated short film, an exhibition that opened at the Wits Art Museum on the 18th of February 2020. The film has gained much attention in the international film festival market, being screened at 16 international festivals and won Best Animation at the 3-Minute Film Festival in Santa Barbara. The film examines
about a couple of minutes or so.
Okay. The film examines animated movements from characters from the golden age of American animation. Using shots from prolific animation directors of the era, I conduct a frame-by-frame analysis into the motion of the characters, much like that of Muybridge on his gymnasts. Through identifying abstract methods of representing motion that gave meaning to movements, the strata stencil technique was used to expose the animation's construction in order to offer a novel viewing experience. I use methods of simplification to further create an emphasis on movement in a montage of action sequences that resist the sequential logic of narrative-driven animation. Okay, I'm just going to skip through the process and just go on to the exhibition. So the exhibition fulfilled three purposes: the screening of the experimental short film, the exhibition of the laser cut frames, and the sideline exhibition that completed an educational role for both historical chronophotography and animation mechanics. The exhibition included frameworks, installation, and print media. The aim was to showcase the material items that resulted from the creative practice in a manner that further questioned their validity as a chronophotographic study in contemporary animation practice. In the static works, levels of repetition force the viewer to see things that they never did before in the film. In this printed version of the film, it reveals the structure of animation itself, breaking it down frame by frame from a process of illusion to a method of investigation. By arresting movement in each shot, I shift the focus on how they were made, one frame at a time, and through this mode of very close analysis, it provides an account of the aesthetics of movement itself. This raises questions about what we are seeing. Does knowing more about a particular technical process shape the way we are able to see it, or even how we see it? Can we treat these works as sites of potential knowledge? And what if we treated a series of frames as a work of art in their own right? These questions and the ones that emerge from them are meant to test the limits of animation. They introduce the possibility of looking at animation differently. My research has revisited the historical method of movement analysis and animated films from a pivotal era. I propose that we look past their immediate attractions towards the elements of their construction, to focus on movement and the aesthetics that operate in this space, the imperceptible made perceptible. As Marbridge and Maury revealed in their 19th century audiences, sequences alone can inspire wonder. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Mark, for that, Bronwyn. Yes. Next, we have Kugumotso Moshugi, who is a PhD student in the music department of the Witt School of Arts. His research, currently under examination, encapsulates his preoccupation with creativity, linguistic translation, choral cultures, hymns, and musical arranging. Yes.
You're muted,
You're muted.
Komodo.
Oh, good afternoon to everyone. Sorry about that. I appreciate the opportunity to also share my research preoccupations over the last few years. I'm trying to share a screen here so that I can go through my presentation with you. I don't know if it's coming through on your side.
Not yet, but you should be able to, Komotso.
Okay, so I'm trying to do that. The screen has gone blank.
Through you, Manola, would you like to email it to me, Komotso, and I could try to share from my side just as a backup?
Oh, let me see what I can do. Yeah.
Just try again. I've just opened it up for multiple sharing. You should be able to.
Or maybe make Moshugi co-host. Would that help?
I think also take up Brett's offer to kind of email it.
Yeah, I'm taking that off. Excuse me, sorry about all this.
I've just made you a co-host. Don't you want to just try it once more? Otherwise, you on our co-host, Komotso.
Okay. Well, I've tried to send it to Brett, so maybe that will help.
I'll let you know as soon as it comes through.
Okay. So maybe I should just
May I ask
open it on
maybe?
my side. Okay. So I will just open it on my side and get going with the presentation. So basically, my research interest coming into this PhD project has been broadly around the issue of the migration of ideas. And because I am a musical arranger and practitioner, I have sort of leaned towards using my own practice to explore the very concept of how ideas shift and move. And I attended a conference that was run by the School of Arts in 2017 during the time when I was trying to conceive my PhD. And it was an interesting conference to attend at a time to hear about how scholars were struggling or were overcoming challenges around artistic practice as research. And in the process, I was able to sort of also start grappling with the concept. Even as I went into my proposal writing, I had to look at what other scholars were saying and how they were understanding practice as research. And that led me to a number of scholars who basically provide the basis and some kind of justification and even advocacy for practice research. However, it was in the process of writing my research where I was able to refine further my particular relationship with this idea of practice research or artistic research. And it's particularly the ideas of Darla Crispin that helped me to kind of build a foundation that I thought was helpful in articulating my own research endeavors. And basically her idea is that, you know, artistic research is about the input, throughput, and output. And in that regard, it's as input, it can help you to frame particular kinds of questions that may not necessarily be framed in the same way by someone who is not engaged with the practice. As throughput is the process of artistic research can help you build a kind of methodology to get to generate knowledge and collect your data. And as output, it can work as a complementary submission to the research itself. And so this is the kind of approach that I used myself to frame or articulate my research project generally. And I think as input, I was able to articulate practice into the kind of questions that I was raising. So my practice as a musical arranger, as one who works with voices, who creates vocal parts, who alters music to suit particular situations, I was able to then frame the question that is encapsulated in the title of the research, which is the transnationalization and indigenization, localization of Euro-American hymns in South Africa through the creative agency of arranging. And I mean, my research questions are broad themselves. And I have the main research questions which relate to just how the hymns themselves have moved from one point of origin to a point of relocation. But I also have sub-questions which, for instance, probe such ideas as to the convergence of cultural ideas in local arranging practices as reflected in historical documentation and disrupted musical and cultural conventions as new ones emerge from arranging practices. I also raise as a sub-questions the question of the extent to which creativity is halted or continues when a composition has already been generated. And I ask whether, you know, creative ideas from conductors, choristers, and others other than the original composer have a place as in the recognition of what we see as creative or the generation of creative original ideas at times. And so in addressing these questions, I've had to build a methodology that is guided by these research questions. And I realized that a combination of qualitative tools would be helpful to expansively respond to these questions. This led me to the idea of triangulation, but also I draw from triangulation to reinforce the idea of rigor and validity for my findings. So this meant that I was able to use interviews, I was able to observe archival material, I was able to listen to performances and recordings and live settings in order to precisely respond to these questions. And I was also able then to bring my practice and my knowledge as a practitioner into the analysis of the materials that I was able to observe. And so while doing all that, I recognized also the importance of observing arranging, not only as an activity, but also as a system. And I was led to the theoretical model presented by Csikszentmihalyi, which basically recognizes a combination of contributions that lead to the manifestation of creativity. And this model has been useful for me to recognize the dynamics and the institutions and individuals involved that are not always recognized when we observe creative works, even though they may have contributions that lead to the manifestation of those creative works. And so overall, while using all these other methods to observe the data that I was engaging with, I had to also get to a point in my research where I had to write what I've called a sonic chapter, hoping that I can present the music as an argument. However, in presenting this music as an argument, I also was able to then draft a chart which in a way fortifies the argument or the idea of arranging as a system, but also that recognizes that movement of the hymn from the point of origin where it's composed in the Euro-American setting, and all the contributions that have led to its localization in terms of where it's practiced within congregations and within ensembles. And I will explain that. Ensembles are small groups in churches that present special music in congregations, in congregational settings. So special ensembles in the congregation of Seventh-day Adventists, which is a community that I have been researching, play an important role, and there's a whole robust culture of ensembles that has manifested over the years, actually since the 1950s, which I recount in the research. And so in this section, I'd just like to give you snippets of or an illustration of what has gone into my sonic chapter, where I trace this movement of a particular hymn, in this case, Joy by and by. So this hymn was composed in the US, but was made into a compilation of other Christian hymns, which was then used by Seventh-day Adventists and moved into South Africa through different interventions, and was available to South African congregations and was picked up by small ensembles, which also enabled them to reimagine the piece. As a result, I'm able then to present to you the movement of this piece. So let me just play for you what, for instance, it sounds like in its original form.
Oh, there be joy when the work is done, joy when the
So that's a snippet of how it sounds originally. And with the translated language, this is how it sounds. So in that moment, we can recognize that there's been a translation from the English to the, for instance, the Zulu version. But when you look at this translation and you work with it directly, you realize that it doesn't work very nicely with the melodic patterns in the music. But this is an exercise that has often been overlooked for its originality. And in my study, I argue that the work of translation has essentially been the work of reauthoring the words, because it has required an extraordinary type of creativity, drawing from the knowledge of the culture, the knowledge of the devotional and theological spectrum of teachings, and the adjustments that needed to be made so that the local expression in the language works with the melodic patterns. And so, yeah, so in this grade, the translation or reauthoring, I just try to give an illustration of the exact distinctions. But this is something that I feel that as an analysis, it is enabled by my own ability or my own practice as a translator myself, and also as a musician who has had to compose and also arrange this music. So next I will play for you an example that comes from a performance of a small ensemble, which
Gomoto, I'd just like to alert you that your time's almost up.
Okay, sure, thank you. So I'll play this example. So when you listen to that example, for instance, you notice that it is drawn from the local translation. But when you observe the musical elements in this local version, you realize that it is further removed from the original, not only linguistically, but also musically, melodically, and subsequently harmonically and so forth. So overall, my study through practice has helped me to recognize that the localization of Euro-American hymns in South Africa has been enabled by local voices and local devotional, I can say like vocal intelligence and devotional intelligence has been required locally to make these hymns localized, including the translation, which has required creativity, and the arranging of these hymns, which itself has represented some kind of geographically, chronologically, and culturally dispersed collaboration with the original composers of the hymn and those who translated. So these local versions represent the kind of work that has a relationship with a creative work that was generated in the past, but reflects some kind of continuing decolonization, if we may say, of the Euro-American hymn.
Wow. Thank you. Thank you, Komoto. We'll move on to our last presenter. Nicola Genovese was born in Venice, lives and works in Zurich, is a visual artist and musician. He works with installations, sculptures, and performances. He is pursuing a creative work PhD at the Witt School of Arts. His research focuses on masculinity intended as body matter and as a social construction. Welcome, Nicola.
Hi. I share my screen.
Yes, please. Yes, please.
Okay. Hi, everybody. Thanks, Daniela and Christoph, for the invitation. And I'm really happy to share with you my research. So I go straight to the point. The topic I'm writing about deals with issues related to masculinity as a social construction, as a body matter. But in my visual work, you might see more general questions about identity, power relationship, body transformation, ambivalence, hybridity, the grotesque, and authenticity. The theoretical starting point of my research is Connell's theory of masculinity. That theory has been very useful to define, even though roughly, the existence of plural masculinities as a set of behaviors and expectation. Connell applied the Gramscian concept of hegemony to masculinity, analyzing as a consequence non-hegemonic form of masculinities that are complicit or non-complicit with hegemonic one. One important thing that Connell and masculinity studies in general achieved has been raising awareness not just on the consequence of certain form of traditional masculinity on women, but also the nefarious consequence on men, like for instance, indulging in medical health, abuse of drugs, alcohol, reckless behavior, simply being a victim of others' men's violence. On the other hand, Connell doesn't give enough tools to define specifically the men who embody the hegemonic form of masculinity. Who represent that? Leonardo DiCaprio or Bruce Willis? What happened then when one man is hegemonical within the family context but marginalized in the work environment? Connell's concept of masculinity takes into account only partially the stratification of different masculinities within one single individual. In the theoretical part, I also confront Butler's idea of performativity and her alleged anti-essentialist approach. This led me to new materialist scholars that criticize the classic postmodernist positions. What happens indeed when masculinity is embodied to the extent that it becomes flesh? I try to answer these and other questions, starting with my positionality. Due to my cultural background, I embody a certain degree of aggression and pressure to perform like a real man. I'm mainly straight and cis, but I like to wear sometimes female clothes, and having sex sometimes feel like an obligation. Should I identify myself as gender fluid or asexual? And concerning whiteness, Italians are still in the whitening process. We are still depicted as lazy, not efficient, messy Italian. Masculinity and gender study in academia generally don't consider identity, complexity, intersection, and nuances. And I'm not talking about classic intersectionality, but rather the multiplicity of factors that constitute an identity. For instance, a white man from Greece in his 60s, retired, low-income class with low education, cannot be placed in the same category as a white boy living in Manhattan with rich family background studying at Yale. The granitic category of the white straight man is not sufficient to explain the complexity of individual's identity. The main problem in analyzing the question of oppression, marginalization, and exploitation is not considering class sufficiently. Indeed, I have to quote Marta Giménez, from the standpoint of Marxist theory, class is qualitatively different from gender and race and cannot be considered just another system of oppression. To be clear, I'm not trying to compete in the race about who is the most oppressed. I'm not claiming that I'm also part of a minority nor a victim because I'm not 100% white or because I'm low middle class or because I don't perform like a real man. What I'm saying is that system of analysis of oppression is inadequate. The lack of complexity that is pretty much present in mainstream academic queer study manifests in dividing society in clear-cut categories, normative versus non-normative, exceptional and special versus boring conservative, and in doing so, fueling exclusion and backlash instead of inclusion. Queer, especially in the Western creative context, became in the last year mainstream. It is enough to look at fashion, art magazine, museums program, and Offspace. not just because neoliberalism commodified it, but because that division creates the fertile ground to develop new, exciting, exotic market share. Of course, many queer activists are concerned about the commodification process, but claiming to be the authentic queer might end up in the paradox of being authentically anti-essentialist. A third perspective on identity issues seems impossible in an extremely polarized scenario like the actual one, where my discourse can be framed simply as white male fragility. What is then the connection between the theoretical reflection and my visual output? My sculptural practice can be divided into sculptural work that respect the rules of the so-called sculptural aura and sculptural works that are activated during a performance. Therefore, they are sometimes props and sometimes sculpture in a sort of a limbo. My sculptural practice is fundamentally based on the relation between different shape and different material. The interest in materiality comes from the will to explore the ambivalence of materials and the friction that oblige materials to communicate with each other. During the years, I developed attention to textile as the primary material for soft sculpture, my practice's core element. I mostly choose ready-made textiles. Some of them have a kitschy, glitters fetish side. Others are cheap fabrics related to domesticity, like towels and curtains. Others are extremely costly Italian textile. I want to show you this piece that was part of a group exhibition in Geneva last June. The exhibition title was Stitches, Body, Scenes, and Decoration. The work title is Cuddling Cutting. This piece is a part of my sculptural production that doesn't include an activation process. The materials I have deployed are textiles filled with padding, metal, copper, ceramic, concrete, leather, ready-made Burano glass, and foam. Challenging the biological body through sculpture can be solely a sort of exercise, an apology to hybridization and fluidity, but also a failed attempt at transformation. Cuddling cutting is a mainly soft sculpture that interacts with other materials. There is a sort of body transformation process going on, but at the same time, the interstitial body is frozen in a badly arranged mix made of human and no human body parts. I often use shape that reminds of horns, snake, teeth, body parts that might be at the same time penis, arms, or soul, or claws. Claws are per se ambivalent. They are dangerous tools, but at the same time, they are also used to hold on. On the one hand, the hybrid sculpture claims its ambivalence, but on the other hand, it has the necessity to return to a sort of stable shape, sorry. The shapes the material that I put in conversation exist bodily, even though they try to escape their biological destiny. I developed material and materiality that underline the struggle between alterity and identity. Identities are socially constructed, but at the same time are internalized to the extent that they become flesh. Materiality indeed cannot just be analyzed through discourse and cultural tools. There are camp queer elements in my aesthetic that try to challenge the masculine body and references to medieval and Baroque grotesque carnivalesque tradition. The pink shoes and the stuffed object sustained by the sharp metal structure and are fabricated to trigger a certain degree of uncanniness. The textile pattern is extremely carnivalesque, and the oversized shoes embody femininity and at the same time a certain degree of shabbiness and roughness. The metal structure aims to support the weak stuffed object, but at the same time, the metal claws squeeze and gently strangle the textile. Ambivalence doesn't have to be seen solely as alternation of opposite, but rather as the whole process of shifting the attention from one stable image to another.
Aspetta che finisco il video. Ciao Giulio, come stai? Un caldo allucinante, no? Aspetta.
Sorry. So the other part of my practice concerns performance. Sometimes a performative piece is developed around the sculptural work that I activate for a specific time. Other performances are rather based on action, text, and songs. In that case, the sculpture becomes props. I will show now a Novanta translated in English 90 degree. This is the part of my PhD research specifically related to Italian masculinity.
Come stai?
Sorry, there is a recording going on.
Un caldo allucinante, no? Aspetta.
Also, you have 3 minutes, Nicola.
Yeah, sure. A Novanta is performance that took place in art spaces and theater in a 20-minute piece. Here you can see the performance in a theater context and the same one in an art space. I'm developing right now a 1-hour version made exclusively for the theater. It will be shown in October in Switzerland in several venues. The piece investigates shade of masculinities in the Italian context that intersect with the trope of Italianness. It's a journey that starts with a biographical first encounter with a gesture that some Italian men perform. This gesture, called a Novanta, mimics a doggy style position. The deconstruction of this gesture is the starting point to further understand the complexity of masculinity in a very heterogeneous cultural landscape like the Italian one, between stereotypes like mama's boy, macho, and unexpected in-between masculinities. Now, because I don't have enough time, I will show you a little excerpt from the performance.
I've been busy for quite a while with the Roman Empire, and then with the construction and fabrication of the nation state. I had also a short experience in East Africa, but it ended pretty badly. Then I decided to focus on the northern part of my country, then on my region, then on my town, then on my street, on my neighborhood, and then on my house. Nowadays I'm pretty busy with my garden, but there will be time to enlarge things again. Mozzarella di bufala, gamberetti, pomodorino, salamino piccante, salamino, pomodorini, salamino, gamberetti, salamino, rucola.
Okay, I think it's enough. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Nicola. And thank you to all of our presenters for fantastic presentations so far. If there are links to your work that you want to put into the chat that we can follow up on later, please do. I'm sure there's a lot of curiosity to do that. I'm going to open the floor to the panelists to respond to these very special presentations. And I was just completely struck with somehow the notion of the interstitial that was present in each of them and what happens in it, whether it was a self-reflective moment, kind of really going into that moment, or the interstices very quickly in the motion image, or across times in history with the song, and somewhere in Nicola's work around a sort of moment of failure of something in that interstitial moment, which was very, very poignant and powerful. So fantastic work. Thank you. Thank you all for sharing your work and the ways it's speaking to each other. I'm going to open it up to the panel to take us deeper and open up this work more. Thank you. I'll call each panelist has about maybe 5 minutes to respond to the presentations, and I'll ask Brett to respond first.
Thanks so much, Manola, and thanks to all 4 panelists. I have to say, as the days progressed, it's become richer and richer, and the sense of connections as well. So I'd like to start from a place where Homotso took us, because I think he does something that's really helpful that started coming through for me in this panel, in the dialogue between the pieces, and that is also placing this notion of what the creative in creative PhD means. He makes it an object of research in and of itself. And he invites us to think about this notion of creativity in and of itself, I think, an ideological critique, and certainly a critique of the notion of individuated sort of genius that largely comes with the colonial paradigm. And what does it mean to think about creativity as something that's collectively produced, even though there may be individual makers? And I thought that this question was set up for us beautifully by Bekelizwe actually in his piece, because he actually explicitly did not present a creative output as such, right? That the narrative inquiry itself is the place at which the knowledge creation happens absolutely outside of any normative art world context. And thanks so much, Bekelizwe, for also, bringing in one example of the many ways in which the kinds of methodologies and research paradigms that we're talking about today have wide areas of application. And in your case, how really rich to bridge the different aspects of your own professional practice in terms of workplace struggle, really, in labor struggles in South Africa. On the one hand, you invited us to think about the performativity of labor struggle and the kinds of world making that it makes. But I think in the context of today's discussion, you also tied in very, very well with the paradigm that Homotso invoked from the music scholar Darla Crispin. And that's to say, creative research can happen at any point in the sequence of the research process. It can be a prompt to research. It can be part of the methodology, as I think is the case in your case, Begi. And it can, but it need not necessarily yield some form of making on the part of the researcher that's performed or exhibited. And I think today we're seeing a range of strategies in relation to that. Bronwyn, thank you so much for this extraordinarily historically rich reading of what could be a very technical and technicist account that you've brought a really thoughtful analytical lens to. I love the way your work does bridge, as you put it, the still and the moving image. And I thought about the ways in which your presentation invites us to think of time and space, and deliberately you spatialize what is usually experienced as a temporal art, and you do the reverse as well. You stretch out in a temporal sequence that's often, sort of apprehended instantaneously in animation. And the dialogue, I think, between the 3 aspects of your exhibition, I think is incredibly rich for us to think about, not only in the case of your own project, but in many of the projects today. A lot of the research we are seeing is historically informed, is tied to particular techniques that have been used in artistic practices, but become a resource for your own making. And I found that really compelling. I've had the honor of working with Komotso closely in the context of his own project, and I'm going to then withhold engaging, duplicating what he says. But I really do think that in his own work, he also troubles the privileging of certain kinds of making. And certainly within the ways in which music histories have been written, the role of the musical arranger is usually relegated to the kind of status of a craft, while composition and often composition that's authorized by a single composer is privileged. And I think the enormous ramifications of his work for the ways, even beyond musical practice, we recognize normative styles of authorial ideology, if I can call it that, and the ways in which his creative work troubles that and simultaneously recovers what he calls intelligences that are located in practices that are often not canonized in any particular curriculum. And then I've always enjoyed seeing Nicola's work and the extraordinarily rich ways in which he moves between media. We've been seeing that all day, the way in which there's a dialogue between visual, the oral, and again, just cumulatively today, the intelligence with which these researchers are engaging with material. That material is never just instrumentalized in the course of making, that it brings its own genealogies, its own ideologies with it. And I think it's really wonderful also, Nicola, the way in which your research straddles domains of material production that have historically been completely fetishized in colonial places like South Africa. The idea of Italian silks or Italian fashion and leather, and the way in which, in a sense, you're bringing through your research a different kind of lens onto one of the sites of origin of those materials. It's a very interesting parallel, I think, to Komotso's work as well, of thinking about these relationships between putative origins and then places that are assumed to be derivative and troubling that. So I'm going to pause with those comments for now, but thank you so much again to all our presenters. It's immensely stimulating to share your work.
Thank you, Brett, for both the insight and the connections. And I invite Morelli into your responses to this lovely work.
Thanks very much, Manola, and thanks very much to everyone for having me. And congratulations to the 4 presenters. You're busy with such
Early, your camera's off.
I don't have a camera, Christo, sorry. The work that you do is extremely interesting and very captivating, and it's interesting to engage with 4 projects that are in different levels or stages of completion. So I'll jump right in. Becky, thanks for a fantastically interesting presentation. I'm interested in the fact that the narrative inquiry, in my experience at least, connects to management science or has its origins in management science. I would be very interested to know how you are using your field of drama research or applied drama, and how this connects to the narrative inquiry. And to pick up on something that Brett said, if this is going to connect to creative research, I enjoyed very much the quote of how you speak and how others speak, and stories become data with a soul. I'd be very interested to know how these stories are going to become creative artifacts or creative parts of your research, of your creative research, or if that is indeed the direction you're going in. I'd be very interested to know whether you envision a kind of artistic product or artistic practice of your own in connection to this research, and that will tie into your methodology. I think that would be very fascinating for me to engage with. Bronwyn, I absolutely loved your presentation, and the work is fascinating. Something that I find particularly interesting is there's a scholar in artistic research, specifically with relation to music, Henk Borgdorf, and he's published quite extensively on artistic research and used to be the head of the Society for Artistic Research. And in one of his writings, he suggests that there are 3 ways of doing research in the art sphere. You do research on art, or you do research for art, or perhaps you do it through art. And I find your project so fascinating because you really seem to integrate all 3 of those possibilities. Research on the historicity of animation and of chronophotography, also research for your own practice. So how could one do this? How could you make it work? And then ultimately also research through the practice, research through making these incredibly beautiful, we saw a little bit about, a little bit of. I'd be very interested to see how you show the integration between the theoretical aspects of your study and your own practice, the information or the knowledge generated really through practice. I know it's difficult to convey that in a single presentation, but I think that'll be an absolutely essential part of the contribution this work will make. Khomotso, a fantastic presentation. I'm also fortunate that I've been hearing about your work and engaging with it for a while. Your study is finished, I think. It's being examined, and I'm looking forward to reading it. And I'm interested to know whether you engaged with, or what level you engaged with, something that comes up in artistic research in music and in composition quite a lot. And Darla Crispin, in fact, writes about it quite a lot as well. I'm not sure which 2015 source you were referring to. But in one, it's a chapter in a book, she writes very beautifully about the ethics of artistic research and composition, that one always ends up with an outcome, so a creative artifact in the form of a composition. And there's been a lot of criticism that if one tries to incorporate research or privilege research above creative output, which can easily happen, it happens at the cost of quality in terms of the composition. Somebody who's been writing about that a lot is John Rink. His well-known article from 2014 is Composition is Not Knowledge. And it's been very upsetting to lots of people in the field. But I'd be very interested to read and see how you negotiated this thing of composition, the composer and the hegemony of Western art music composition styles, the tension between what you end up with, the product, versus the process and the reason why you used composition as part of your method. But I agree with Brett that it's fantastically interesting that you take composition so many steps further, going to arranging, reauthoring, and that connects to Crispin also, I think, extremely well. So your idea of music as an argument, offering music as an argument, that absolutely fascinates me. And I'd be very interested to see how you negotiate the tensions between music as an argument versus music as an artifact. And then Nicola, also, it's wonderful to engage with your presentation. Thank you for very interesting work. It's wonderful to see how you're challenging so many different aspects of masculinity and all the related issues. I am very interested to see, I always speak about artistic research at the moment very much in relation to the Journal for Artistic Research, because that's my main exposure to the field. And the question the Journal for Artistic Research always asks is, how do you expose the research that is embedded in the practice? And how do you expose the processes that led to the artifacts that you've created or the performances? So I'd be very interested to see how you access the subjective knowledge, the experiential knowledge that is generated through your practice, certainly dressing in a certain way, making certain sculptures. The very, very interesting tension for me between the sculpture and props. At one moment, it's a sculpture, which is a reified artifact. And the next moment, it becomes a prop, which actually serves a completely different artistic practice. I find that fascinating, and I think potentially very generative of interesting ideas and interesting outcomes. But my main question to you would be, how will you go about accessing your subjective knowledge, your experiential knowledge, which is generated through these processes that you put yourself through? And I'll stop there as well. Thanks very much for great presentations, and I look forward to further discussion.
Thank you very, very much, Morelli, for that comprehensive response. Samuel.
Thank you, Manola. Well, when one speaks last, everything else has been covered. So I'm not going to repeat much of this stuff that Brett and Morelli have highlighted, and go on to say a few things about the general before I come to the specific, in order to avoid repetition. So first of all, This is not my first time to attend an ARA organized symposium or colloquium. I think ARA has been doing this for quite a long time, producing very fantastic results. I do understand that Mellon grant funds will be depleted at some point. And I'm putting it to Brett, the head of school, that this kind of platform where the school is discussing ideas between staff members and students and so on will need to be sustained beyond the lifespan of the money that is already available. So I just want to put that up front that the school has been very active in terms of knowledge production and sharing that knowledge through this platform. So that's a general one, but something that's important to the life of the school. Secondly, I've been reading around the pillars of an art school, and one of them is the transdisciplinary nature of studies. And I have to say that all the contributions that I've listened to since this morning, including the 4 that have just happened now, point to a very important aspect of the cornerstone of the school, which is transdisciplinary studies. If you look at Becky, combining issues relating to ARA and issues relating to how we can use drama in order to create new knowledge and using narrative inquiry as a methodology. Really fascinating. Something new always comes up when 2 disciplines or more than 2 really come together to point us to gray areas that are interesting in the academy. So I found that quite exciting. I do know that Beck and I don't agree on many issues, but let's agree that this is a fantastic presentation that you've made today. And I think there's a lot of oomph and health in the study that you're trying to do, and I do respect that. The third point that I would like to make relates to the intersectional nature of studies. I think the more I listen to white scholars critiquing white masculine power, the more I realize that issues are not black and white, but very intersectional. I'm speaking this in broad terms, listening to a presentation on Vevood and apartheid and male and Christianity, all that in the morning, and your presentation, Nicola, this afternoon. It really points to the different ways in which we can understand the issues of gender beyond what we normally read in the books. And I really found the research quite exciting and refreshing in those kinds of directions. And I would say that all the works that I've listened to do really present novelty. It's new territory that you guys are treading on. And it was really exciting to listen to all the researches that you were sharing with us. Now, I know that I was mixing the general and the particular. In some instances, I'll become a little more particular now as I progress. Nicola Genevieve, thank you so much for your presentation on the ambivalences of white heterosexual masculinities beyond the oversimplified category deployed in gender studies. I think I've had more specific comments to you regarding the issues of intersectionality that I mentioned earlier on. Becky, I loved the way you combined issues of ARA, human resources, and the intervention of drama in order to generate new knowledge in that regard. But because you mentioned the broader scheme of a thesis comprising 7 chapters and so on, something that you may wish to consider is that I thought the first chapter is a little bit more packed in terms of what you would like to cover in that particular instance. Please do consider the way in which you can bring the research design to incorporate issues of narrative inquiry, which is your methodology, in a kind of more expanded form that speaks to the way you would like to carry out this research. I thought that the material that you are trying to find out is more pronounced in your chapter 5. And we seem to be lacking the build-up or the methods that can speak to what you are finding in chapter 5, which by the way is very exciting, I must say. Let me go to Bronwyn. Very exciting articulation of issues relating to chronophotography and visual representation, and applying that concept to contemporary art. I thought that was really fantastic. I'd never really imagined how one could use animation in order to produce something exciting in the arts. And I would like to, maybe in order to carry the work forward, ask you to reconsider or to make the problem of the research more pronounced. The more you articulated issues, the more I read the abstract, the more I started asking myself, so this beautiful presentation, what is it that it is trying to make an intervention towards in order to solve a problem? Probably just be deliberate in terms of highlighting what the issues of problem could be in that regard. Have I left anybody in terms of specific comments? I think I've covered everybody. The work was brilliant. I agree with Brett. I agree with Marel. And yeah, there we go. I'm done. Thank you, Manola.
Thank you, Samuel. We have 3 minutes before we close. And we've had some comments in the session, but I also want to give the presenters an opportunity if they'd like to speak back. I mean, there are a couple of minutes, or if any of the others want to speak back. Well, we have 2 minutes now. So I'll hold a moment for that. I think the one, I mean, I'm curious actually, since Gugomotso, the presentation is, your work is done, and I'm extremely curious, and it's about where it's going to go now and where you're going to take it. And I think there's a lot of excitement for the work, and you know, where it's already speaking back to both history and as well as music and other things. But I'm just very curious about where you'd like to take it.
Yeah, I guess this is a good time to be asking that question, because that's exactly what I'm thinking about. I guess for many, many months, my preoccupation has been about articulating the thesis itself and getting it to at least where I could submit it. But what I've learned even in this session through the feedback that I've received, that we are receiving from everyone, is that there are so many possibilities. And I think from each comment, I'm already seeing elements of what I could, you know, build on for future studies. But I appreciate this whole idea that Marilee pointed out to, this whole kind of debate around composition and arranging, that I think, you know, I'd like to see how that moves forward. But I guess the heart of my scholarship also is really in recognizing creativity in areas where creativity is manifested but unrecognized. Powerful. So to kind of privilege a scholarship that goes into those areas.
Powerful, thank you. I think that's an excellent statement to kind of close our 3 sessions. Because it ties in with artistic research and acknowledging the epistemic strength that the creative offers us. So with that, I'm going to close. Thank you very much again to all 3 panelists and to the 4 fantastic presenters. And I'm good to close the session. And I know that we're coming back. There have been a lot of things that have emerged in all of the panels, and there are questions to think back to, both for the presentations, but also to how are we thinking about creativity, performances research, artistic research. And I'm looking forward very much to that discussion at 3:15. And I'm going to hand it over back to Christo now. Thank you.
Manola, thank you very much, and for your extremely adept chairing of the session. And yes, please, everybody do come back at 3:15 15 minutes to grab a cup of tea or whatever. And it's an opportunity to really, firstly, to give the presenters a chance to speak back and ask further questions, and then to try and identify larger patterns, tendencies that are emerging from the creative work PhDs in the school. So we'll see you back, and please make sure you use the last link, the link for the 4th session. Okay. Till then, bye.